any further ado, I'm super happy to introduce my guest, Helen Riess. And Helen is the Chief Science and Chairman of Empathetics. She's the Associate Clinical Professor of Psychiatry of Harvard Medical School. She's the Director of Empathy and Relational Science at Mass General Hospital and the author of the book, The Empathy Effect. Helen, I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, I'm super happy for you to be here. So tell me a little bit about why did you write this book, The Empathy Effect, and what's it about?
So the empathy effect really is emerged as the empathy research that my team and I have been doing for about 15 years. And as we've developed more and more content and also knowledge about how empathy works, we are bombarded with questions, not just from healthcare, which our empathy training, research is focused on, but from parenting organizations, educational organizations, business organizations, leadership, and even politics. So as these inquiries kept coming in, and also as I was being interviewed for many other books, I realized that there is an application for empathy to all these domains, and that it would really serve the, the audience outside of healthcare well to understand how empathy works better and how it really applies in these different domains, what they have in common and how they're different.
Great, yeah. So before we get too much into this work, maybe it'd be helpful for us to define some terms. We talk about empathy and empathetic and empathic. We talk about empathetic concern or empathic concern, or empathy accuracy. Can you talk a little bit about terms and how you use them?
Sure. So just simply the difference between empathetic and empathic is empathetic is more of a lay term that most people use in normal parlance, and empathic is more of a neuroscience and research term, which I tend to use because that's the world I live in. So empathic capacity really gets at the fact that empathy is not one thing. Like when people say, oh, she has a lot of empathy, does it mean she perceives really well other people's feelings, or that she's able to process them, or that she's able to respond in a certain way that really feels connected? Because we've been able to, through neuroscience imaging studies, understand that there are different pathways. So there's an input where we need skills and observational tools and emotional connection to actually perceive what other people are feeling. And for some people, it just stops there. They can perceive well, but they actually don't know what to say, or they don't know how to respond. So there are processing mechanisms that enable people to become more accurate at identifying what other people's feelings, intentions, motivations, and desires are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the empathic capacity is the whole thing, from perception, processing, to response. Empathic accuracy is when you really have understood another person's emotions correctly. And the only way we really know is if we, we feel like we've got it, but then we have the courage to say, is that accurate? Is that what I'm feeling? And when the response is, yes, you get me, then we can be sure that we have empathic accuracy. Mm. And the other term you were asking about was empathic concern. So the way the brain works is that we perceive, and when most of us, when we see someone in pain or suffering, we experience some discomfort ourselves, because other people's feelings actually do get mapped on our own brains and pain centers. And that leads to a feeling of concern. And humans are made to get this feeling to motivate them to do something to help. But it really is just a motivator. And when we actually do it, then it's called compassion.
So there's an action. Am I hearing you say is the difference between being empathic and compassionate is the action?
Yes. So when you say someone is compassionate, it's because you've observed something. Like you wouldn't look at a statue and say they have compassion. Like either the person has shown a look, made a gesture, helped somebody, donated money. There's something that they have exhibited somehow. So compassion is the outward manifestation of being moved by somebody else's plight or suffering.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I'm feeling empathic with our audience. I think I'm hearing people say there's like someone typing on a keyboard or something, and no one is. I'm not, you're not, and Dana's on mute. So I'm not sure what that noise is. And so I'm being empathic about that. And I'm sure that's distracting. And I'm going to invite us to tune it out. You know, it seems crazy for me that I'm just now sensing in our conversation a clarity around empathy that I hadn't had before, where I'm getting a sense of empathy being like this loop where I take in information and I process the feeling, the experience of that information, and then I exhibit an energy back with that, there's like this loop. And what we in my work at Learning in Action, we measure both sides, but I never thought of it this way. We measure empathy accuracy in terms of how accurate am I able to take in the inputs, and we measure empathy compassion. It's like, how much do I care? And the two are separate, and someone can be really good at one and not very good at the other. And I didn't completely get that until you talked about there being two like different processing loops in there.
Well, that's exactly the terminology that I use in the book, the empathy loop, because it really is a dynamic flow of information in and caring and compassion out. But I do want to say that we don't always complete the loop. We can't. You know, it's not possible to respond to every experience of somebody else's suffering. So that's why I think they're separated, because you know you have to regulate how much you can actually respond, or you might never sort of get home from work.
Right, for sure. So so is your sense that empathy is something where like it's innate to us? You know, I think in the book you talk about us being endowed with empathy, but is that the same thing as the idea that we're all born with it?
So empathy is an inborn trait. So as early as 3-month-old babies, they respond to other babies suffering. And as early as toddlers who are like 3 years old, if their mother gets hurt, they try to help. So this is pretty early in development. Little children know when somebody else is being picked on, and they do this with puppet types of simulations. And little kids get into a lot of distress if they see one puppet stealing a toy or hitting another puppet. So these feelings of discomfort when others are being harmed are really hardwired, which is not to say that there aren't people with deficits. Everything in human development is on a continuum. So I'm not saying every single person in the world has a capacity for empathy, because we know there are definitely people who do not. But they are, out on the spectrum as being more unusual. And the other the myth about empathy used to be that it was fixed. You either have it or you don't. And that has really been debunked, because we know there are many forces that nurture empathy, that cultivate it, and there are other forces that can beat it out of people. So it is a dynamic capacity that really depends a lot on inner resources and external demands.
So is it fair to say that for us to be as empathetic with others as we can be, it requires us to resource ourselves?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a funny analogy, but you could never drive a car past the amount that you have gas in the tank, right? At some point, if you don't fill the tank, you're going to run out and the car is going to stall. And the same goes for an empathic capacity. People love to give because it feels good, but at some point they start to get exhausted and tired. And it is so important to have what I call self-empathy, so that you're taking care of yourself and sort of charging that battery so you can go out and be present in helping others.
Yeah. Do you find that caregivers are particularly bad at that? Is that just my experience?
Well, yes. I mean, it is really an interesting thing that, you know, helping others actually feels very good. And you can imagine that if we didn't feel good about helping others, our species probably would not survive. I mean, we all have to be, you know, connected in communities that collaborate and cooperate, where there's reciprocity for life to continue. So it has to feel good. But some people don't know their limit to when they've exhausted their own internal resources, or that they're exposed to an inordinate amount of suffering. Like if you think of EMT professionals,
Mm-hmm.
or trauma surgeons, or therapists working with trauma survivors, people that have, or oncologists who are telling people every day that they have cancer. These are massive onslaughts to a reserve of empathy, because you're getting tapped into and merged with people's bad news and suffering, and we need to buffer against that, or we lose the capacity to help at some point.
Right, right. So is it possible to be too empathic? Like some of the questions that we got from our audience was like, how do I avoid, you know, emotional burnout, you know, secondary trauma? So how do you, and I experience it in my community, how burnt out, not just burnout, which is a little bit different. There's being burnt out because we're not resourcing ourselves, but then there's taking that on ourselves, which is another level. I'm curious your thoughts about being too empathetic and what happens when we take that on.
So your question about can we be too empathetic, the answer is yes. You know, empathy is a precious and like a cherished human capacity to help others. But as I just said, if your makeup is to take on other people's feelings in a very profoundly, deeply felt way, you can become overwhelmed by this. And everyone's capacity for empathy is different. So in my work in health professionals with health, it's often that they become so distracted from the work with patients that their empathy is suffering. But there's another continuum where there's too much and they're suffering because they don't have those boundaries between self and other that is clear, like that is your suffering and I'm here to support you, but I'm not here to absorb it all. Yeah. So there's a part of the brain involved in empathy called self-other distinction. And if there are any scientists on the Podinar. It's in the superior parietal lobule. So they have really identified a place in the brain that brings in that cognitive piece that says, you know, he or she is going through a horrible loss, and I am really moved by this, but I need to stay in my role as helper. Because if we are a coach, a nurse, a physician, a counselor, a therapist, people are coming to us not to kind of dissolve in tears with them and be, you know, just as upset as they are. They're coming to us, they're looking for a rock and a foundation to make sense of the trauma and to process their own sorrow. That doesn't mean that shedding a tear or being moved is a bad thing. I think that feeling connected on that level, like that person really understands. But we do need that boundary between our role as a professional helper and not being, you know, that person's sister or cousin or best friend, because they're going to get that emotional contagion there, which might feel good from a friend, but they're coming to a therapist, a coach, another helper to also make sense of it.
Right. And so what's your best I don't know if the word, but recommendation for those of us in the kind of relational professions that have a little bit more permeability in that lobe where we're taking on too much of our clients' work?
Well, realizing that all of us in helping professions also need support. So going at this as a lone ranger is a risk. So there can be professional support groups where the identity of any of the people that coaches or therapists or anyone are taking care of remain anonymous, but where the feeling of what it is to work with a person who's been very traumatized or is going through a very difficult time, where that emotional burden and labor is processed with either peers or a person's own coach or therapist. Mm-hmm. So the idea that we're just helpers, but that we don't need help ourselves is really problematic. So peer supervision, peer support, individual, whether you want to call it therapy, counseling, support. If you're in a profession where you're constantly exposed to suffering or trauma, that is essential. In the old days, there used to be something called Balint groups that Michael Balint, who was a primary care physician kind of leader, he recognized that primary care physicians deal with so much unexpected pain, bad diagnoses, you know, all kinds of social determinants of health, overwhelming problems. And back in the 60s, he recommended that at least 1 hour a week that physicians get together just to process the emotional burden of all of these problems. Wow. And it's coming back now as something that we need to build into our system, because the secondary trauma thing is real. There's only so much you can take and responsibility to boot without sharing a difficult story or hearing another colleague. Like, that's the place to cry. That's the place to say, you know, my favorite patient, I just had to tell them that, you know, that they have pancreatic cancer. It's killing me. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of the support piece. The other is self-care and self-empathy, and what Kristen Neff calls self-compassion, which means, it's beautiful. Her work recommends meditation, self-kindness, and the third is shared humanity, which means that we're all going to make mistakes and we're all just human. And when we make them, we need to be as caring and considerate of ourselves as we would be to our best friend.
Yeah. Yeah. So empathy starts with ourself, I feel. You know, I just recently finished reading Kristen Neff's book, so I highly recommend it. It's a book on self-compassion. I think she probably has lots of books, but I just read her book on self-compassion, and I had no idea. She has an autistic son. I have an autistic son, and she's got amazing stories about her work with her son and her work around self-compassion. So strongly recommend it. So let's go to our audience. So I see a question, and I'm going to go to Dana in just a moment. Oh, hi, Gail. Gail asks, what do you recommend for leaders that feel empathy will undermine their expectation of others when there are performance issues?
That is a great question.
It is, isn't it?
Because it's very natural to think that empathy and accountability are on opposite ends of the spectrum. I actually think that they're very linked. So I call it misguided empathy if you let workers get away with things that they shouldn't because you feel sorry for them. Like, oh, don't worry about it. You know, well, the client will understand. Don't worry. So, you know, we have to uphold, you know, the integrity of our businesses and what people expect. But we can also be empathetic and curious about why did things go wrong? Why was that deadline missed? And instead, I think the key here is to not judge the person before we understand what happened.
Yeah.
So it's really maintaining a stance of curiosity before we go to judgment.
Yeah.
So I have so many examples of where somebody wasn't getting something done and the team was getting really frustrated and angry that one member wasn't, you know, pulling his weight. And it really took some conversations to find out, like, what is really going on here? And when people don't feel like they can say, I've got this personal issue, or, you know, I don't want to burden the team with my problems, they can say nothing, and then everyone just thinks they don't care. So starting with curiosity.
Yeah, I so appreciate that, because it's like if someone's not performed, it seems like the very first thing we can do as leaders is be curious as to why not, which is a form of empathy, I feel.
And when someone's not meeting deadlines, or they're, you know, missing work or coming in late, and we have no idea what that's about.
Right.
And if we assume right away, like, negative things, like they're lazy, they don't care, they have a poor work ethic, that may all be true, but wouldn't it be better to start with, I've noticed that coming in on time seems to be a challenge. You know, help me understand what's going on. If you start with empathy, you know, you might get a story of some vulnerability that they didn't want to say, you know. And if you start there and you get, you know, a snarky answer or defensiveness that doesn't really feel like, you know, it is about vulnerability, but maybe they're out looking for a new job, that's an important conversation to have too.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. And if it's not a good fit, you know, having that empathic conversation might help the employer know, like, it's time to, like, look for a replacement, and also to say, you know, it's not always a good fit. And, you know, why don't we talk about what would be a better fit instead of getting into a tug of war?
Yeah, for sure. And the other thing that comes up from Gail is that there's some potential, like, self-other off-balancedness for people who have a hard time both being empathetic and accountable, holding people accountable. Anyway, so Dana, what is going on with in our audience besides that crazy noise, which is distracting? I get it. I hear it too. So,
yeah. So we have a great question from Tim Brody. He asked, so if everyone is empathetic, is there really such a thing as empaths? Or is that a description that fits everyone?
An empath, as I understand it, is someone who is exquisitely sensitive to the feelings of others. someone who will walk down the street and see a homeless person and almost like start crying because they can imagine the horror of living on the street so acutely that they get dysregulated. Not everybody is an empath. Most people have empathy, and just like intelligence, there's like a distribution curve. We have people that are super intelligent. We have people who are lower on intelligence, but it doesn't mean that people don't have any if they're just lower on the spectrum. And the same is true for empathy.
Yeah. So as an empath, Tim, I can tell you that it being empathic and being an empath are not the same thing. If I'm not, if I don't have a good container around myself, and I began working with a shaman to improve my containership. If I don't have a good container, I will literally feel the feeling, like feel the sensations other people feel. So feel in my body what they're feeling. And so, yeah, if you identify in our audience of someone as an empath, in other words, like you can physically feel the experience of someone else, then working on ways, and there's a woman who's written a book, I can't remember her name, it's specifically for empaths, but it's around developing your ability around containership. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so what are roadblocks to empathy? If empathy is a good thing, why aren't we all empathetic or empathic?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are many roadblocks to empathy, and I think we hear about this on the news almost every single day. When there is conscious or unconscious bias toward other groups, the judgment and the sense that not everybody is worth our caring and concern is a real roadblock to empathy. Yeah. And if we have prejudice against others, that we don't really get to know people as individuals, but we've decided that certain groups deserve our empathy and others don't, that is a cognitive choice to block your empathy. The antidote to that is to get to know people who are different from us. There are programs like Dinners Across Difference is a program you might have heard of, where people intentionally have dinner with people who are from different backgrounds, different countries, different races, different sexual orientations. And the point is just to get to know each other as people. And it's a profoundly important step. And also exposing our children to people who are not like them is a really important part of a broad education. Other roadblocks to empathy are things that put us into fight or flight mode, because then we are focused on our own survival and not the survival of others. So when we feel criticized, so this is why, really critical feedback from a boss is not very helpful to get people to change, because they go into fight or flight and they probably can't even hear anything positive. They just feel like they've been caught out as being inadequate, and that puts people into a very closed down mindset. So, but like even in healthcare, if a patient comes in and criticizes a doctor or nurse about this didn't work, I felt worse, that can initially block empathy, because the healthcare worker is taking this personally, as opposed to broadening the perspective and saying, and realizing the patient's upset about the medicine not working. It's not really an attack on us. So when we experience things as attacks on us that are really about something else, our empathy is blocked. And in healthcare, I've observed a lot of interactions, and when doctors and nurses get defensive about, maybe you didn't take it right, and maybe, you didn't follow the direct, again, instead of showing curiosity, let me understand better what exactly happened. Because then you might find out you know, that the directions you gave were misunderstood or that you were unclear. And then you have a chance to clear something up. But if you go right into defense mode, you've alienated your empathy and the person feels judged.
Mm-hmm.
When we feel criticized, when we feel put down, when we feel misunderstood, and when people are yelling at us or even rolling their eyes or, you know, giving us a bad look, sometimes our empathy just goes out the window because whose pain are we focused on? Our own.
Yeah.
I mean, it is an incredibly simple but extremely difficult idea when somebody's upset with us to say, I want to learn more about what you're feeling, instead of like, I didn't do that. You know,
right.
And the secret is when you are open to learning a little more, even though it might feel threatening, you're probably going to help that person's upsetness diminish.
Yes.
Whereas if you come in with defense, it's going to keep escalating.
Yeah, right. Okay, so I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it's very hard to learn to do this, but that's why empathy training takes time, right? It's not like, oh, just do this and you'll be more empathetic. It's like we have to practice these things, and then we recognize, oh, I did that again. And instead of being full of self-criticism and judgment, just say, I'm still on a learning curve.
Oh, yeah, giving yourself some grace.
Exactly.
Yeah, giving us the grace that we would want.
We would give to any friend.
Else. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So tell us about teaching people to be empathetic. Obviously, you're here because it can be trained, right? So tell us about how it can be trained, how you know it can be trained, a little bit about your experience there.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, whether it could be taught was really the question behind a lot of our research at Mass General Hospital. So understanding how the brain works was really unlocking the secret to how to train and teach empathy. So a lot of it is learning how to read emotions accurately, how to, first of all, start with enough self-awareness that we know kind of where we are emotionally before we engage with a coachee, a patient, a friend, a spouse, a partner. So it really does begin with some self-awareness, like, I'm in a good place. I think this is like a good time to open the door and have this conversation, as opposed to being frantic and late and like, instead of getting settled, or like the way you started this Podinar, Allison, was to say, what is our attention today? I think that's a beautiful example of like, instead of just hopping right in here and starting to talk, it's like, what are we doing here together? What are we trying to accomplish together? So starting with what I call a mindful approach, and some people call a beginner's mind, is like the best way to start any interaction. Mm-hmm. And then our training focuses a lot on picking up emotional cues that are coming through facial expression, posture, tone of voice, by naming people's emotions, what we think is going on. That's actually becoming intentional. Like, she seems really concerned. Like, if I make that mental note, or she seems really anxious, then I'm not going to butt in and start offering a bunch of advice. I'm going to realize I need to hear this person out, because they've got to get from this level of emotional upset a little down before we can actually discuss what's going on. So it's picking up emotional cues. It's understanding how people are affecting us internally, or what I would call physiologically. So, you know, when we're sitting with people, we have a feeling of whether things are going well, like that feeling of being in sync. we know it, but most of the time when we're in sync, we're not thinking, hey, we're really in sync, but it means people are feeling pretty good about, the conversation. But internally, we get signals when we're not in sync. Like someone gives us a look or doesn't quite, like right now you're nodding like you get me, right? So I feel like we're in sync. But if all of a sudden you were like, making some kind of thing. So we can either choose to ignore that signal and just keep talking, or we can say, do you feel like you got what I meant right there, or did something not quite land well? So being just sort of more moment by moment attuned. Now, with coaches who do a lot of phone coaching, and would that be the case in many?
Phone, virtual, probably in person as well, but also via video and phone.
So I just believe that as many channels that we can open to really take in what all these signals that people are giving, the more empathic accuracy we're going to have. But I also know that experienced coaches get very good at picking up tones of voice, silences, like little ways that people disconnect. It's a little bit harder if it's on the phone, but on the phone, you are way more tuned in to tone of voice. And that is actually one of the most powerful conveyors of emotion is tone of voice. But if people are halting and there's a big silence after you've said something, it's probably a good idea to say, help me interpret that silence just now.
Yeah.
Like not like that was a communication. Just because it wasn't full of words doesn't mean it wasn't a communication.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that's coming up for me, for some reason I'm flashing back to a meeting I had with someone yesterday. It's a project we're working on. There are two of us, and a gentleman, this is via video, he looked to me to be physically distressed. His words weren't conveying it, but physically he looked really distressed. And it was one of those situations where it's the lesson I'm coming to is like, if I were to kind of empathetically accurately or empathically accurately from my head say, you seem kind of upset today. Or I knowing him, I think he would have felt critical. And so it's just reminding me that I can't do empathy from my head. I've got to do it from my heart. Which is like, how are you feeling? Like, how are you, buddy?
I think your point just now is a really important one, because that choice between naming an emotion and knowing it might feel like the person feels criticized, where other people might feel like, oh, she really gets me. Like if you said, you just seem really distressed today, people, sometimes they start crying. They're like, I am. But when you know the person and you've got more information about, any vulnerability about having emotions named, then of course you only name that to yourself.
Yeah.
And you might say something more general, like, this sounds like this is really hard stuff. Instead of saying, you look really upset. But what everyone needs to do is say to yourself, he looks really distressed. He looks really upset, because that will shape what comes out of your mouth.
Yeah. And I'm just now realizing that a question I might have asked is like, how are you doing energetically? Because even emotionally is a sensitive place to go.
I like that.
Yeah. How are you doing? Because that's something he could hear.
Yes. Some people hear the word emotion and they hear it's weak, it's wrong, it's inappropriate. Emotions really are what makes relationships work. It's picking up on, connecting, settling, inspiring, appreciating. These are all it's an emotional dance, you know. But the word is loaded, and it's really great to find words that are more neutral.
Yeah. So I'm seeing a couple of questions in the question box. Heidi is asking, can you briefly describe secondary trauma and how coaches might experience it? So I have an idea, but what do you think, Helen?
I'm really curious about your idea. And so secondary trauma, as I understand it, is when a helper starts getting a lot of emotion contagion, where the traumatized either victim or patient or accident victim, whatever it is, where their experience starts to map very strongly on the helper or the caregiver, so that the suffering starts to dysregulate the helper to the extent where they start to suffer either physically or emotionally or with depression or anxiety, to the point where they are now traumatized themselves. That's how I understand it.
Yeah, I went to a 7-day silent retreat at Spirit Rock, I don't know, maybe a month ago. And there was there was a wee bit of talking one time during the week where some of us got together and had a chance to process with one of the teachers our experience. And there was a therapist there who cried all week long. And the sense I got was that she was suffering from the secondary trauma of her patients. She wasn't able to create a sufficient container for herself, or a sufficient boundary between she and herself. And she was really traumatized. So what I would say is secondary trauma occurs when we're not able to sufficiently self-contain, separate. And some might say that one of the reasons we might experience secondary trauma is that there's something for it to hook on. That can be something within us that is not maybe sufficiently processed. That's why it's so important for us as relational, in relational professions, to do our own work, so that there isn't any, this unprocessed trauma to hook onto.
Well, what you're addressing right now is the fact that we have the most empathy for people who are like us, and for people who have suffered like us, and for people who share a common goal. Like, those are the top three that we have our most natural born empathy. And I think you're absolutely right that if other people's trauma is landing on top of our own, the reactivation of unprocessed and unhealed wounds can really feel overwhelming. And that's why self-awareness going into these professions and understanding our own vulnerabilities is critically important. The other question, of course, is what do you do about it? So this person went on a retreat, and sounds like had a deeply processing experience that hopefully helped heal the person. We also have to be mindful of the caseloads that we take on. There are people who are easy to help, and there are people who are more challenging to help because of the tactics they use, the things they pull out in us. And it is a professional duty to examine their own caseload and really ask yourself, do I have the resources to take on another person with this issue that activates me, or with this degree of trauma, when I have 3 other people or 2 other people that are actively working on this. So this is a professional duty. It's not like, oh, I should just take on everybody because that's what I'm here for, and how can I turn a person away? If we get overloaded by taking on too many difficult cases, we're no good to anybody. And that is going to lead to a burnout situation that I have actually seen people consider leaving their professions because they get to such a depleted state. So we have to think long term about, is this really helpful to take on something that I know is going to put me over the edge?
Yeah, you know, I just will put this out there into the universe, everyone listening, everyone who does what we do, for us to look at the new decade ahead, to look at 2020. And we tend to say yes to things and believe that because I can, I should. Many of us do. And we doing what we do have to restore, reserve, resource ourselves. And sometimes that means saying no, and saying no is a bigger yes to something more, not just for us, but for the work that we can do. So yeah, I just felt like I wanted to say that. Saying no can lead just to a bigger, more important yes. Yeah, so we've got 2 questions, and I feel like, though, I want to get to, well, I was going to say getting to the EMPATHY, or let me turn it back to you, Helen. This is an audience who wants to know, oh my gosh, like, I want to help my clients be more empathetic. How do I do that? And I feel like you've covered some of that. If there's anything else more you want to say about that, as to how coaches might do that with their clients. And the other thing, that key questions that we're getting, and it is very true, is like, what if someone doesn't want to be empathetic? Or what if they're coming to coaching because they're having, their colleagues are experiencing relational challenges with them, lack of empathy is part of it, but they're not showing up saying, I want to be more empathetic. So can you convince someone to be more empathetic? And then, assuming that someone wants to be more empathetic, is there anything more you want to say about how you can help someone be more empathetic?
Okay, so I'm trying to understand this question as maybe being a not infrequent request that someone's looking to coaching because they've gotten feedback that they don't have empathy.
Yeah, they don't have empathy, and maybe they don't care that they don't have empathy.
Well, I think it begins with tapping into self-empathy and exploring, was there a time when you needed someone to understand you, or you felt like they really blew it? And the best way to empathy is to get somebody to feel in their own bones, in their own heart, what it felt like to be misunderstood or judged or not cared about. So I think a lot of it begins way earlier, before we try to tell people how they should be to other people, is that we have to understand maybe how they built up the defenses against their own emotions that makes them not want to go there.
It feels so important, and I can anticipate that some of our audience might be asking themselves, like, what is that, therapy or is that coaching? Because that's a question coaches ask themselves pretty frequently. And you all have to do what you're comfortable with. And my personal take, and I want to hear what you have to say, Helen, is that as long as there's something that's showing up now in the present that isn't working or healthy for the client, then understanding the root of it can be maybe the best way to the extent that they are willing to share, at the level they're willing to share, may be the only way the change occurs, is understanding where it started?
Well, I do understand the distinction between coaching and therapy. And I recognize that sometimes there's a little bit of overlap. And if it feels like it's going way too much into therapy, it's the coach's duty to understand what's coaching and what needs deeper work. So I'm not suggesting that you start therapizing. What I'm suggesting is, as a starting point, are we in agreement that one of the reasons you're seeking coaching or you've been recommended to coaching is that you don't seem to display empathy? Like, are we agreeing that that's the problem? And is this something you're interested in changing? And if they say no, then it's like, well, will there be consequences with your keeping this job if that doesn't change? So then they have to say, well, okay, I don't want to, but I guess I have to. And then I consider some questions just probing questions. Was there a time when you yourself didn't experience empathy, or when you were hurting and somebody seemed not to care? Like, a probing question would just be like, is that accessible to that person? Can they immediately come up with an example and say, yeah, that happened to me when X, Y, and Z. And then if they quickly can say, if that's how I'm coming across, like, I really want to work on this.
Yeah.
Right? There's a very immediate disconnect with how they want to be. And as soon as they realize how lousy that feels, that's coachable.
Yeah, I so appreciate how you put it. So you didn't go back to childhood and how did this get to this way? But if say what's it like for you not to feel understood?
Right. So you're still in the present. They might relate back to something in their past, but if quickly they can get to oh, I get it. That is a horrible feeling. I do want to work on this. But if you get two other reactions, one is you hear a horribly painful story. The person starts really emoting and dissolving in tears or getting super dysregulated. That's probably not that coachable. That person probably does have to work something out. Or the opposite, if you go no, I've never had anybody do anything like that. I don't even know what you're talking about. That degree of defensiveness is not super coachable either.
That's super helpful. That's super helpful. Well, I can't believe it, but we're at the end of our time together. How did that happen?
That went fast.
It did, didn't it? I loved it. So.